Welcome to the Decoding Interpreting video series presented by Boostlingo. In this series, we explore the nuances of the interpreting industry and provide valuable insights for language service companies and professionals seeking to deepen their understanding of interpreting services. This video provides a high-level overview of interpretation. We will discuss the skills used by interpreters, the different delivery methods, and things to consider when deciding on the interpreter arrangement that would best fit your needs. My name is Rocío Trevino, and I am the Director of Quality and Compliance here at Boostlingo.
And I'm Sarah Atalla. I am the Interpretation Quality Assurance Analyst here at Boostlingo. So let's kick off our discussion by talking about what interpretation actually is. So interpretation is rapid oral message transfer, meaning that interpreters have to render messages, not word for word, we render messages in the moment from language A to language B. And there's a process that an interpreter's brain undergoes when we interpret that consists of 3 different steps. The first is active listening, which is where we actively pay attention to what's being said for comprehension, so we can understand the meaning or the message. And then we move on to step 2, which is reformulation. And this is what we typically think of when we think of interpretation. It's where we flip word order, we substitute different words so that it sounds normalized in the other language. This is also where we take into account cultural context, tone, intention, what the speaker is attempting to convey. And the third step is production, which is simply what ends up coming out of our mouth. And this consists of, good diction. Are we speaking clearly? Are we speaking too fast, too slowly? Are we enunciating, etc.? There are 3 types of interpretation as well. The first being consecutive interpretation, which is this idea of turn taking. This is where the speaker speaks, and then they pause, and then they allow the interpreter time to interpret. The second one is simultaneous, which, as the name suggests, is this real-time interpretation. The speaker does not pause, and so while the speaker is still speaking, the interpreter has a bit of a lag, and they're interpreting everything that's being said in real time. Now, this can be done either with headset, kind of like Rocío has, that has a microphone, or it can be done with the interpreter simply lowering the volume of their voice to not compete with the original speaker. And the third and last one is sight translation, which is where you take a written text in language A and you orally render what's on the page into language B.
Thank you, Sarah. And some of those message transfer skill sets that these interpreters have include many things. Of course, they must have a robust vocabulary to be able to interpret what they're hearing from one language to the next. And as you mentioned, there's also that on-the-spot thinking. They have to be quick in making those decisions that they're making with their interpretation. One of those things that they focus on is accuracy, which involves not just relaying the same meaning for meaning, but in carrying with it the same tone, intention, and context of the conversation. Many times interpreters have to intervene for correction or clarification, and that is absolutely necessary as well, a skill that many interpreters have to work on because it is vital to making sure that everything is effective and one person is hearing the exact same thing as the next. When we talk about the different delivery methods, we know that there's on-site where they are in person, and then there's 2 different types of remote interpretation that we're going to talk about, video remote and also telephonic interpretation, which is OPI. First, talking about on-site and in-person interpretation. This is something that is usually pre-scheduled versus on demand. You don't walk in somewhere and expect an interpreter to just show up with you. You do have to generally pre-schedule these interpreters to be where they are needed. The advantage to this is that it is more personable. You may be more familiar with the interpreter, have them on more than one occasion, and they are of course also physically there in person with you. So it has that advantage of proximity, which also can be a disadvantage because that limits your pool of interpreters. You can only rely on an interpreter that is physically within so many miles of where you need them to be. So that proximity can also be a disadvantage. Additionally to that, if they are limited to being in the room, there might be space limitations. And of course, if it's a medical setting, there are the additional limitations with exposing additional people to whatever may be in the room. So those are the both advantages and disadvantages of having an on-site. And passing it back to you to talk about remote.
Thank you, Rocío. So in contrast to on-site or in-person interpretation, remote interpretation is largely on demand rather than pre-scheduled. However, depending on the language you need, if it's a language of lesser dispersion, where there are fewer interpreters available, pre-scheduling may be necessary even with remote interpretation. Some advantages of remote interpretation are interpreter availability. We've already talked about this a bit, in that if you are limited geographically by the number of interpreters of the language pair you need that live, within a certain radius of where you need them to be, that is a limitation that is removed when you have remote interpretation, because the interpreter can connect from literally anywhere around the world. So more interpreters available is a huge advantage. In addition to there being more flexibility with healthcare settings or home visits, things of that nature, having as much flexibility as possible is also very needed. So not just is remote interpretation on demand, as we mentioned, but also you can get an interpreter on the line using a cell phone, as opposed to having to, always be sitting down at a desk at a computer or using a landline. So that flexibility as well is very helpful. Now, a few disadvantages with remote interpretation is that naturally there's a higher inherent risk of technical disruption, meaning whenever you're using technology, things can fail, right? Audio can fail, video can fail, things like that. From an interpreter's perspective, it can be difficult, specifically with telephonic interpretation or OPI, because the interpreter has no visual cues. As an interpreter, we cannot see who's in the room, we can't see what's happening around us, so we're kind of flying blind, so to speak, and so that can be a disadvantage with OPI. For the same reason, it's also less personable. You can't see the interpreter can't see you, and so you kind of lose a little bit of that human-to-human feel. And then lastly, whenever you have, many users worldwide that are utilizing remote interpretation services, naturally some will be more accustomed to working with interpreters than others. And as a result, we see that sometimes there can be inconsistent expectations surrounding the use of interpretation services and what it should be and what it shouldn't be. First and foremost, I want to emphasize that if it's an encounter that's sensitive or complex or involves a delicate conversation, such as, for example, domestic violence, abuse, mental health, end-of-life conversations, anything of that nature, it's highly encouraged to utilize in-person interpretation services. These types of topics are just simply better handled by having that human-to-human interaction. Interpreter availability, we've already mentioned this, but that is an important consideration as well. User familiarity with technology. So specifically with VRI, you use different VRI platforms such as Zoom or WebEx, or it's by no means an exhaustive list. Some people are simply more familiar with the technology, both in terms of the client side and also in terms of the LEP side. And so that's something to consider as well. User preference kind of goes along with this too. Some people just prefer to have in-person interpretation services available to them if possible. Also, sometimes LEPs may have difficulty hearing, or so that could play into their preference as well. Time constraints, whether it's an emergency or a non-emergent encounter, sometimes you just simply don't have time to pre-schedule an interpreter. You just need someone right then, right now. And if that's the case, then remote interpretation is probably what you would choose to do.
Thank you, Sarah. And that brings us to the end of this high-level overview of interpretation, the skills used by interpreters, the methods of delivery, and things to consider when selecting the interpreter arrangement that would best fit your needs. In the end, interpretation makes real-time communication possible wherever it's needed. We hope you found this topic of value and encourage you to explore the other videos in this series. Thank you for your time and attention.